Hello, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming for the second day of the workshop. Yesterday we had a very busy day. We ended quite late because of that as well. And I would like to first, before we start, thank FAPESP for the support for this event. Thank INET as well, which helped us give with funds for the young scholars. Thank the speakers from yesterday, Martin, for the presence and for the presentation yesterday and today. And I need to read a disclaimer for everyone as well. So all statements expressed by Fundação Getúlio Vargas employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on FGV's official channels. To continue with this transmission, we ask everyone to please express your agreement by verbalizing or signaling your agreement. And thank you. And we should start our day. Martin, please.
Obrigado. Com esse disclaimer, a Fundação Getúlio Vargas está quase na mesma categoria que o FMI e a Reserva Federal. Impressionante. All right. Really? Well, yeah. Yeah, my views represent my views and not the views of Columbia University. So this morning I'm going to focus on international finance, and we will discuss how sovereign debt markets work. And I will focus on a specific problem, but within the broader context. The specific problem is what's going on in the world right now, especially in the southern hemisphere. What's happening in Africa, what's happening in a number of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean that are suffering from crisis, debt and development crisis. But going through that will require to analyze how the system works. So this will be a presentation about the system as well. And to understand the system, we need to understand international politics. We can't really understand sovereign debt markets simply from an purely economic angle. Finance is not just an economic discipline, but it's also political science. Without understanding power dynamics, we can't understand how the rules of the game are shaped. And those rules determine outcomes. They determine both how countries make financing policies, but also how, when there are crises, how they are resolved, okay? The first feature that needs to be discussed, we dealt with it yesterday. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Which is, not the first one, this is not the first one, but the main tenet when we think about financing for supporting the development efforts of a sovereign nation is that the capital could flow from the textbook tenet, right? The capital will flow from the country in which there is more capital and therefore lower marginal productivity of capital to the country where there is less capital and therefore higher marginal productivity of capital. Well, that's not really how the global capital market works. We would ideally want sources of financing that are stable long-term, especially considering that the investments that yield development returns may take years for those yields to actually be seen. For instance, if someone starts primary school today, that person is going to enter the market maybe in 20 years. And it's going to be at the peak of the return to education maybe in 35, 40 years, so, or even more. So it takes time, and that's the kind of financing for development we will want to see. And the second is that rates should be sufficiently low. Of course, if we had perfect capital markets, we wouldn't need to discuss any of this. The Modigliani-Miller theorem that many of you learned in your careers will hold. Well, that's not how things work. The way things work is as we discussed yesterday. All right, I'm supposed to, okay, is that we have an asymmetric global financial system. The asymmetry begins with the private capital market, but it's at times even exacerbated, as we will see, but with the official financing. It's supposed to act in a counter-cyclical way, and that's not always the case. The Latin America debt crisis of the 1980s was a very clear example of this pro-cyclicality of capital flows for developing nations. What's happening in Africa today, it's another example. These are the two big examples that we had in the last, say, 100 years, because the instability of capital flows grew after the end of the Bretton Woods regime. And these are the two major events that we had. Official capital flows, as I was saying, don't outweigh those asymmetries. There are policies that can even exacerbate those asymmetries. I'm going to refer to two very quickly. One is, I don't know if you've heard about the IMF investment model. So the IMF, created in 1945 at the end of World War II, is supposed to be an institution based on solidarity. Solidarity doesn't really exist in the world. That's not how things work. But it's supposed to be an institution that plays a counter-cyclical stabilizing role in the global economy. Okay? Well, it turns out that when the IMF lends, it charges interest rates are higher, much higher than what it needs to cover its operational cost, the cost of financial intermediation. So the IMF makes profits, and those profits are safe. The IMF gives that a name. It's called precautionary balances. Okay? So now you have an official institution with countries that are their members saving, and those savings need to be invested somehow. Where do you think the IMF invests that money? Yeah, well, even more, AAA assets. That means that Egypt, Pakistan, Argentina, Ecuador, Barbados, that had a hurricane, those countries in crisis pay extra interest, so money flows from the developing nations to the IMF, and then it goes from the IMF to the advanced nations. Invest in BlackRock, US Treasuries. So that exacerbates the procyclicality of capital flows for developing nations. And also, there is an anchor in the system for the interest rates. Well, the main anchor is the US Treasury rate. But for official international financing, is the special drawing rights interest rate, SDRI. Special drawing rights interest rate. So the special drawing rights interest rate is a weighted average of the yields of the treasury bonds of the 5 countries or regions that issue reserve currencies. The currencies that basically count as international reserve assets. The US, the UK, the European Union, China, and Japan. So that means that if the Fed runs a more contractionary monetary policy, it increases the interest rate, that's, of course, going to transmit to the treasury yields, and that leads to an increase in the SDR rate. And the SDR rate is included in the lending rate of virtually every international financial institution. So World Bank lending becomes more expensive. IMF lending becomes more expensive. This is what's happening now. When the US, the Fed, the European Central Bank wanted to fight inflation after the war in Ukraine by contractionary monetary policy, Argentina, Ecuador, Pakistan, all these countries pay more on its debt to the IMF because those are floating interest rates. I don't know what's going on with this. Okay, so this is the evolution of the SDR rate since 2019. It was 0 by 2020, and then it went up to above 4%. The lending rates are much higher because there's a basic component plus the IMF imposes surcharges. Today are lower than a few weeks ago because they were reduced. But as you see, in the 1980s, the big problem with the countries from Latin America that had debt was that they were floating interest rates. So when the Fed increased the rate, they had to pay more. Well, now there are also floating interest rates with the IMF, with the World Bank. So African countries that owe to the international financial institutions pay more, not just to Wall Street creditors when they need to roll over the debts. They pay more to international financial institutions as well. Okay? So this is how the anatomy of procyclicality of capital flows works for developing nations. First, there is an increasing global liquidity as a consequence of monetary policy in advanced economies or some global shock. In the 70s was the creation of the OPEC. The oil exporting countries had massive surpluses. They would save those surpluses in the American banks or the Swiss banks or Japanese banks, and these banks had to do something with the money. They had to lend, but there were no lending opportunities in the advanced economies, so they lent to Latin American countries in the form of bank loans to the sovereigns, or to Eastern European countries, or Egypt. And typically this behavior happens when the interest rates in the advanced economies are low. So there is a process of search for yields. This is just straightforward, right? So I'm an employee of Columbia University. The university has to manage my pension savings. So it has to place them into an investment. And there is a competition. The different investment funds or hedge funds will compete for returns. And when returns are very low in their home countries, they seek for opportunities elsewhere. And this is associated with a political agenda. If you need to look for opportunities elsewhere, you need to be effective in your political lobbying to impede that the countries adopt capital controls, because otherwise you can't go to Brazil or Colombia and take the money in and out whenever you want in a second. In the Bretton Woods period, there were capital controls, and this could not happen. So that's what we virtually saw, no sovereign debt crisis. But since the end of Bretton Woods, there were no longer capital account regulations, capital controls. Again, that's part of a political agenda because there are big, big economic and financial interests behind. Then capital flows to the riskier economies, but this is not cheap money. Not cheap money. Countries pay high interest rates. The trade rating agencies have a very influential role in how capital markets are organized. So private capital was good at getting organized and getting exempt from regulations that would normally apply in a reasonable world. This is ISDA, International Swaps and Derivatives Association, very influential. Most of the movies, Inside Job, and most of the movies about financial crisis quote ISDA, okay? And they managed to be unregulated, and they determine the risk premium because the ratings have a direct influence on the risk premia that countries pay. And typically, the risk premia are high for countries from the developing world. Say African countries, when they borrow in after 2008, we will see that, they were paying interest rates of between 9 and 11% in a world of zero interest rates. Okay, so this is not, and the maturity of the bonds were 5-7 years. That's not financing for development. Okay, then when a shock leads to a change in the monetary policy position in the advanced economies, say the inflation in the 80s or the inflation in 2002 after the war in Ukraine, then the flows revert. This is what's called flight to quality or flight to safety. Money goes to where it feels safe, and it feels safe in the advanced economies. It feels safe in the countries that issue reserve currencies. So that leads to capital outflows if there were no capital account regulations in the first place, okay? And that creates the balance of payment distress. That leads to a need for a big adjustment if there is no possibility of rollover, or in one way or another. We will discuss that. And it's the mechanism that ends up creating the crisis. There are multiple externalities associated with this process. There are exchange rate depreciations. The exchange rate depreciations have consequences for the real economy, and countries suffer destabilizing dynamics. Typically, development falters. What most countries do, as we will see, is they cut on the public sector cuts on what it can, what's more flexible spending, like education, health, public infrastructure, science. And at the same time, that contractionary fiscal policy stance leads to a contraction of imports, because if there's a recession, imports fall. And that's what tends to create the foreign exchange to continue repaying the debt, or these countries get support, quotation marks, from international financial institutions. We will see why this happens. This is not for them to do counter-cyclical macro policies. It's for them to pay the private sector, as we will see. I mean, the evidence is absolutely overwhelming. This is not the narrative you're going to read in the Wall Street Journal or Financial Times, but this is exactly what happens. The data is really overwhelming. Let's see what happens now from the debtor side. So I just showed you the side of the creditor. You have the investment funds, which today dominate. In the 80s, it used to be banks. Today it's investment and hedge funds. But we have the other side that is also part. It takes two to tango, we say in Argentina, right? And so the debtor is the other side that has to be behaving in a way that is conducive to these outcomes as well. So what happens on the debtor side? Typically, these countries have low savings and thin capital markets. So there is what we call a high shadow price of financing. You're willing to pay more for financing. You're sort of desperate. And they have typically, so the government cares more about the short term than about the long term. It cares more about the period in which it's in the government, or about the next election. So the discount factor for governments is generally higher than the discount factor for the society as a whole, and non-linear. You don't care so much about what's coming when you can't be in government. So these political economic considerations means that there tends to be not just over-lending, but over-borrowing as well. You want to borrow more than what you should. And what this essentially means is that the side that runs the show here is a creditor side, meaning that lending occurs when lenders want to lend. The borrower always wants to borrow, almost, not everyone. I didn't want to borrow more in foreign currency. I borrow zero in foreign currency. But most times, if the financiers want to provide financing, debt grows. And when the flows revert, the same structure of incentives that we saw on the creditor side applies on the debtor side. Virtually no government wants to begin a debt restructuring, meaning a process in which you negotiate the value of your debts to pay less and pay more in the future, and pay in the future rather than now. Because that's costly. It's costly because politically there are consequences. Imagine that you are dealing, I mean, I negotiated this, I ran the second largest sovereign debt restructuring in history in 2020, Argentina, $110 billion. And the reduction in debt payments was $35 billion in 10 years. How much do you need to pay a journalist, or not just one, 100 journalists to put an immense pressure on the TV, on the newspapers, on the radio? How much out of $35 billion? So you can imagine the lobbying and the pressure, and it's like the end of the war. The message that you're going to get in these countries in crisis is, if the country doesn't pay and begins a restructuring, everything is going to fall apart. It's going to be the end of this country. So typically there is delay in initiating a restructuring. And typically the amount of relief that is achieved is insufficient to put the country back on track, to restore what we call debt sustainability, meaning that the country can meet its commitments at the same time that it can continue along a path of economic and social development. The costs are very high. Typically what we see in this debt crisis is unemployment grows, poverty grows, inequality grows, there is distress in the society, there is lack of hope, and an entire generation gets affected by that. That's what happens. And there is something else. Many times you get these. You get bailouts by international financial institutions, the IMF mainly. Bailout means that someone else puts the money so the country can pay. Argentina 2018, borrow in 2016, $100 billion, 100 billion in just 2 years. And then when the capital markets closed for the country in April 2018, the government sought for an IMF loan, and it got it. Trump wanted to support Macri by then, provided the largest loan ever, $57 billion. For Argentina, that's 12% of GDP, out of which $45 billion were disbursed. The disbursements stopped when Macri lost the election because it was to support Macri to win. And the country had the debt, but that money was not used for countercyclical policies. It was used to bail out Wall Street creditors, to pay the debt that was coming due, and to finance a massive capital flight. That's another story. Investment funds from California and Wall Street had been exploiting carry trade opportunities in Argentina. And then they left. But how was the capital flight financed? With IMF money. This is very common, and this creates what we economists call a non-convexity, a problem of incentives. If you're going to be bailed out, I tend to overlend. Okay? Good. Where are we now? We've been through 3 major shocks in the global economy that created a debt crisis and a development crisis in the South. First shock, oops, this thing here. You see dollars being printed. What do you think it is? Exactly. 2008. The Lehman Brothers fall. It changed the world. And no, this is not, I'm serious. The Lehman Brothers fall and the response of the US government to that, which was a bailout of its banking system financed by taxpayers, changed the world. It changed the balance of power between the private sector and the public sector in the entire Western Hemisphere. We see it in our continent. I don't have the graphs for our continent. In one of the papers that I quoted in the reference, you can see it. I'll point out which one. But if you look at Latin America, since 2008, debt grew and grew, and mostly with the private sector. That's the liquidity that was created. And the increase of the interest payments to GDP in the budget meant that the fiscal space was reduced. No wonder it's so tough for governments to keep the popularity. They have very low capacity to deliver on economic development. So the constraints are much tighter. By then, there was a commodity boom in the region. So it looked like, okay, we can borrow. But then the commodity boom was over, and in most countries, the structures of production had not changed. This was a problem in Africa, again, in the entire Western Hemisphere, and it changed the politics. In the US, it changed the politics because it changed the balance of power. If a finance minister from a South American country, not Brazil, but another one, take Argentina, it's an actual experience, talks to the secretary of the US Treasury for 1 hour, gets nothing. You talk to the governor of the Central Bank of China for 1 hour, you can get a loan if you want. Okay? That means that the US doesn't have any control over its financial sector. China does. It changed the geopolitics, the 2008 crisis. But all that increase in global liquidity, as you will see, led to growth in debt in the South. Then we had the pandemic, which put stress in the public finances in many countries. And finally, we had the war in Ukraine, and you all know what was the response, a contraction in monetary policy. So quantitative easing was creation of liquidity. Then we had quantitative tightening 16 years later, reduction of liquidity. Financing becomes more expensive and more scarce. And then you start to see the problems, countries that can't roll over the debts. And when they can't roll over the debts, they resort to, typically, to measures that don't work because of the reasons we discussed before. Look at the data. Stable debt, this is for low and low middle income countries. You see that there is a stability until 2008. It grows. And the bar that grows the most is the light blue. That's the private sector. Okay, the debt of countries low and low middle income with the private with everyone and private sector. Which is the other color that grows? That's China. That's China. Well, of course, you will see now the multilateral institutions, and you will see the data that explain that. But the other one is China. China became bigger. It's a player. China was not a player in the war in the 1980s when Latin America had its debt crisis. It is a player now, and this also changes the nature of debt negotiations. It has also become a lender of last resort. There was your very interesting presentation yesterday. I was thinking of one important episode in the global economy that affected geopolitics, which is when the yuan became a reserve currency. It became a currency in the SDR basket, in the special drawing rights basket. So that had an impact for you, for the BRICS. If you look at the role that China was playing, or the importance that China was giving to the BRICS vis-a-vis the IMF, you see a change there. But you also, the most important part was the change in the importance of the BRICS vis-a-vis China itself, because now China became a lender of last resort. I can give you an example, a very concrete example. In 2023, I was no longer in government, Argentina paid the IMF with activating the swap with China. That's something that couldn't have happened before, but it happened in 2023. The fact that China's currency is part of the SDR basket entails a different level of tradability and a different role for China in the global economy. We're going to see a different war in the next decades. It's not just going to be the IMF, the institution that determines the rule for multilateralism. It's also going to be China. And China will develop its own debt sustainability analysis frameworks. Why will China abide by the rules of an institution that is mostly controlled by the US Treasury and with the influence of Wall Street? So this is important. And the other part of the story is the evolution of that distress. The red line is countries that are in that distress. The data I got it here in 2022. We will discuss what's happening right now in the next chart. And the blue is high debt distress. There were no countries in that distress in 2013. And you have more than half of the countries from this sample, low and low middle income in debt distress. Again, this is the situation after the war, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. And this is the data on flows, the procyclicality that I was describing before. Again, low and low middle income countries. That's why it says LMIC. In 2022, the flows with the private sector changed. You see 54.3 billion of positive flows from the private sector. Again, at a very high interest rate to these countries. Money flowing from the international private sector to this group of countries, minus 51.2 billion in 2022. How was this capital flight finance? This is money that is going from the countries to the private creditors. They are paying. How do they pay? Mostly with this money. This is international financial institutions, IMF, World Bank, African Development Bank, etc. $32 billion. That money is supposed to use to alleviate poverty, invest in public infrastructure, countercyclical macro policies. No, it's not used for that. It's used for bailing out creditors. So that's a crisis. That's a crisis. You don't see many defaults. Again, if you read the Wall Street Journal or the FT, they won't say that there is a debt crisis going on right now because there are no defaults. But there are no defaults because countries are using the money from international financial institutions and cutting on domestic expenses and triggering deep recessions. So they don't default on debt with the private sector. They default on economic development. You look at the evolution of the net interest payments relative to revenues and relative to GDP, how it grows. This means lower spending in education, health, public infrastructure, etc. So there is a real development crisis going on. These situations require debt restructurings. Think of the following. Contract between a debtor and a creditor with a risk premium. The risk premium is the recognition that the debtor won't pay in every possible circumstance of the economy. It's a recognition that there will be states of the economy in which the debtor is not supposed to pay. That's why it pays a risk premium. But the contract doesn't stipulate what those circumstances are. So the way the contracts work is that the creditor keeps the right until to get paid everything, the total interest rate, until it voluntarily accepts to restructure the contract. There has to be a voluntary deal between the two sides because there is no bankruptcy court, anything like that for sovereign nations. We will discuss that. So when these situations happen, it's the time for a restructuring. Otherwise, the countries fall into the stabilizing dynamic. What does the macro, that you know better than anyone in the world, and you were discussing yesterday, the macro sovereign debt distress tells us for countries that have a foreign exchange constraint. It tells us that it has when it gets a negative shock, when capital flows revert, and the capital account becomes negative, it needs to adjust but it needs to go to a current account surplus. Okay? And basically, there are three ways in which this can happen. It either contracts imports, but that creates a recession. It expands exports, but that doesn't happen in a moment. I mean, even less if it's not investing in what's going to create more tradable production. Or it needs to finance the capital flight, focusing not on the current account, but on the reserves. But these countries typically have no reserves. Otherwise, they would have been paying the debt. Or a debt restructuring reduces the interest payments and therefore improves the current account, or that improves the capital account by reducing the amount of debt that needs to be amortized. Those are the options. If the country doesn't perform a debt restructuring, the evidence, again, is overwhelming. It gets into a destabilizing economic situation. But again, as I said, there is no system. This is the missing piece from World War II, the architecture after World War II. There was the creation of the IMF, the creation of what then became to be the World Bank. Later on, the WTO. There was no international mechanism for the restructuring of unsustainable debts. So what we have is what some authors call a no system. We can also call it a system in the ISET system. It's a system that has been dictated by one side, mostly. And there needs to be bargaining. You sit and discuss with your creditors. In the 1980s, things were very different than now. I did my PhD at Brown University. And 1 year at Brown, I had one scholarship called the Bill Rhodes Scholarship. Bill Rhodes was the chairman of the Citibank. He called himself the banker of the world. but he was called the banker of the world by others as well, because he was the one coordinating all the creditors, all the banks that were the main creditors of the Latin American countries. And a debt negotiation will literally be one table. On one side, you have the debtor representatives, typically the finance secretary or the minister of finance. On that side, you have 5 to 10 bankers. And in the corner, you have the representative from the IMF, someone from the staff. And in the evening, the treasury of the secretary of the treasury of the US would get a call from someone, typically the IMF staff, getting informed on what was going on. Okay, that was how negotiations took place. Today is very different because there are no bank loans. The main source of financing to sovereign nations is bonds, not bank loans. And bonds are tradable. You can go to your home banking now, probably, I guess, I don't know how it's in Brazil. In most countries you can do it, and buy a bond or sell your bond. And no one knows who holds those bonds. When I restructured Argentina, said I had to hire an international company to find out who were our bondholders. We have to pay for that. And we got to know 32% of our bondholders only. So you don't know who holds those bonds, and you have to negotiate with them. And there can be 50 investment or hedge funds, and you can have like Italian pensioners holding bonds, many different holders, so the complexities are much higher. That doesn't mean that the outcomes are too different. In the 80s, Latin American crisis, countries were, really destroyed. Many of them ended up having hyperinflations. The exposure of the American banks was so large to Latin American debt that the US used all the power of its foreign policy to avoid a default. And countries were basically using their very scarce foreign exchange to repay the American banks. And that's when they ran out, in a context of major distributional conflicts, they ran out of foreign exchange, inflation went up. And we had a lost decade, lost in terms of economic growth, and also in terms of the performance in general in Latin America. So it's not that things were working that well. One of the papers that I quoted at the end, what we did was we studied the process of the formation of the Cartagena Group. Cartagena Group was a group, a club of debtors from Latin America in the 80s that were not being able to get a suspension of payments or get relief. And they started to get certain concessions, and there was anxiety. And there are CIA reports that were leaked later on that we went through that basically revealed the role that the CIA played in breaking the Cartagena Group. And they managed to do it through Mexico. Mexico was the first country leaving the Cartagena Group, and that destroyed the whole club. And again, you see, divide and conquer. Then the banks basically were fine. In the late 80s, because this is key, the value of the debts today is the market value. So if you have a bond, if you have an investment fund, counts the price, the market price of the bond in its asset. In the 80s, that wasn't that way. So the value of the loans was the value in the books. So if you had to recognize that the actual value was lower, you could have a balance sheet crisis, a bankruptcy, okay? So when the banks were already good enough, in good shape in the US in the late 80s, then there was a plan called the Brady Plan to restructure the debts, okay? You see how important it is to understand the politics, to understand financing. Okay, so now it's different, as I said, not only because of the bonds, but also because of this, what you saw in the previous graph, that there's a different group of creditors. There were only Western creditors in the 80s. Today you have the non-Paris Club creditors, China, India, mainly, and to some extent Saudi Arabia and South Africa. The IMF plays always a key role, but this role has been evolving. It's like the referee, but the referee sometimes calls more for one team than for the other. Okay. Good. I don't know how I'm doing in terms of time, so I will have to cut part of the presentation. Okay. Environment for sovereign debt restructuring, featured by asymmetries, pervasive asymmetries between the debtor and the creditor. Asymmetries of power. There are some debtors that are relatively powerful, the large ones, from the emerging countries or developing economies. Argentina is a relatively powerful creditor compared to Ecuador, okay? But typically there are big asymmetries of power between the creditor and the debtor side. And the kind of lobbying that I was describing is one manifestation of that power asymmetry. In a debt negotiation, it's key to win the battle of the common sense in the global narrative. This is so important. What I mean is the debtor is going to be portrayed as the unethical, recalcitrant debtor that doesn't meet commitments. But again, the debtor may be borrow at 700 basis points of risk premium, right? So there was risk. And there is really a problem of capacity in certain circumstances. Most countries pay when they can't pay. They don't pay when they can't pay. There are almost no strategic defaults in history. But that's the kind of tension that you will see. And you need to create a common sense that the debtor is doing the right thing. You use all your tools. For instance, when I was restructuring the debt of Argentina in 2020, there was a letter published in Project Syndicate, signed by more than 150 experts, 4 Nobel Prizes, 2 former undersecretary of the US Treasury that were no longer working with the financial sector or no working, one from a Republican government, another one from a Democratic government. Actually, sorry, I'm saying it wrong. No, only one from the Republican government. The one from the Democratic government didn't want to sign. Not surprising. And the letter was saying that what Argentina was doing was the right thing, and it made it to the it was a headline. It was in the cover of the Financial Times. I mean, it made noise, and I will get messages from the main creditors. I can actually read that. Let me look for it. Because this is very interesting how it works. Okay, this is the message from the top creditor, the largest in the world. Minister, is there any way that you can send a message to the people from the academia that you recruited to support your proposal, telling them that the process is already on its way and it's no longer necessary to comment on the issue? This creates a cost, okay? So that's how the battle is played. There are asymmetries of information. As I said, the creditors know everything about the debtor. All the information is public information. But the creditor knows the debtor knows very little about the creditors. You may not know what your who your creditors are, and whether they have insurance in the form of what's a credit default swap. And therefore, the default may not affect them, but basically affects the company that sells the credit default swaps. You don't know what the incentives of each stakeholder are. So these asymmetries of information are important for the bargaining field. There are asymmetries in terms of time horizons. Sometimes the main problem is to deal with your own government and your own political system, because they don't want a short-term cost. They don't want to fight too much because that's costly. So you just have to fight more with the domestic side than with the external side. And there are moral hazard issues that we won't have time to discuss. But the way to address the current crisis that was thought was the creation of a coordination forum called the G20 Common Framework for Debt Treatments. 4 countries initially applied, they got nothing. Zambia, Ghana, Ethiopia, and Chad. This was 2021. And of course it doesn't work because the main problem is the structure of incentives. If you don't change the structure of incentives, you don't get a difference in outcomes, okay? And a key issue in the current processes of debt restructuring is what to do with domestic currency versus foreign currency. This is so important for the future, and I wish we have more academic work on the issue of local versus foreign currency debt treatment and the consequences that it will have for the macroeconomic of countries in the future. Let me tell you the situation. Of the countries in crisis today, many of them borrow for the first time in international credit markets after Lehman Brothers, the times of plentiful liquidity. But they didn't adopt capital account regulations. So they borrow both in domestic currency and in foreign currency. But it turns out that one of the main subscribers of the debt in domestic currency are the same subscribers of the debt in foreign currency, the same investment funds or hedge funds. If there are no capital controls, you take your dollars to the country, you change the dollars by the local currency, you subscribe a bond, and then if you want to leave, you sell your bond, you get the local currency, change it by dollars, and leave the country. Okay? So now the problem is that some investment funds that have debt in foreign currency say, look, why am I going to provide relief and my neighbor, that is one block from me, that also holds bonds but in local currency, doesn't get any haircut, and it can convert those bonds into dollars, into foreign exchange easily, because there are no capital account regulations. So there is pressure for restructuring debts in domestic currency. Sri Lanka, for instance, restructured the debt in domestic currency. One of the main creditors of the Sri Lanka's treasury was the central bank of Sri Lanka, and of course it was much easier to roll over the debt with the central bank of Sri Lanka than with a foreign creditor. But what that means is that these countries will have less capacity in the future to borrow in local currency. So they will have to resort more either to liquidity in foreign currency, which they won't have for years, or central bank financing, which creates inflation under certain circumstances, if there is no increase in the demand for the domestic currency. So it creates a problem either of currency mismatches or directly of nominal instability. One way or another, there are problems, there are instabilities. Besides, the holders of domestic currency include the pensioners, the domestic banks. There are macroeconomic consequences in the short run. So there are short run and medium long run effects of treating the two groups of debts in the same way. Of course, there is a tool for dealing with this that is not being discussed, which is the adoption of capital account regulations. But again, it was not done at the moment in which these markets were developed. In one of the presentations yesterday, I also was thinking of one situation that I dealt with from a practical viewpoint. I was involved, which is someone asked a question about China's bonds. The way China has been defining the bonds. So in many, with money, so if you want to transfer money from your bank account to a bank account, from one country to another, you use a bank account. So the capital account, typical capital account regulations apply to the banking system. Okay? With bonds, it's different. You use custodians. The most important international custodian is Euroclear. So the transfer of the bond is from one custodian to another custodian. And most countries don't have any control, any regulation for the transfer of the bond from the local custodian to the foreign custodian or the international custodian. But China has been including regulations within the covenants of the bonds, so they can't be transferred freely from one custodian to the other. Why is this important? It looks technical, but this is when a country applies capital controls, not capital account regulations on the inflows, capital controls on the outflows. Typically, what it gets is an exchange rate gap. Why? Because you can use another instrument. For instance, bonds, like in Argentina. You use bonds to trade currency, and that creates a parallel market, legal. It's called the CCL, or blue chip market. If you also apply capital account regulations in the covenants of the bonds, you have to look for another instrument to transfer the currency freely, maybe cryptocurrency. But that's different. At least today, it's less big than the market for bonds. But this is an important issue. The way the countries that are growing in the financial system are developing their own bond markets. I know Brazil has, you have to convert the dollars into reals immediately when they hit the country. That's the way it works. So you don't have free transfer also through the bonds. You don't have like Argentina that has a free movement between Euroclear and Caja de Valores, which is our own custodian. But again, this is a key issue. It's going to matter for the development of domestic capital markets in general. The case for capital account regulations in an environment of imperfect capital markets is, of course, well established. We know about this. There is literature, especially from 2008, literature from before, but in the mainstream, the literature grew significantly after the crisis in the US in 2008. And the goal is to disincentivize carry trade flows that create excessive instability, but not to disincentivize the more stable flows, FDI. So that's why basically the view that prevails in this literature is that there should be regulations on the inflows. You adopt reserve requirements. For the company that is going to drill in Vaca Muerta, it doesn't really matter because it's not going to take the money out in 1 month or in 1 day. It's going to stay. So if you put a reserve requirement that says you have to keep the 30% of your inflows in the country for 6 months or 1 year, no problem. But that totally discourages the speculative capital that wants to exploit carry trade opportunities. Argentina has had those regulations from 2000, after the crisis in 2001, 2002. They were adopted in 2005, and they lasted until 2010. In 2010, the country adopted controls to outflows, and that led to 2011, and that led to an exchange rate gap. But the regulations from 2005 to 2010 work very well. Of course, the macro dominates Argentina, yes. The macro always dominates. If you have an imbalanced macro, you have a current account deficit for too long, no financing for it, eventually you have a crisis. But given a sound macro, the capital account regulations prove to be effective to reduce the instability in the economy. Good. So let me close this presentation with a brief discussion of what's being discussed in the international sphere for how to fix this flawed system. I'm going to refer to only 3 of the many proposals and details to the 3 bigger components of the system. The first one has to do with, there's a typo there, with the creation of an international system for sovereign debt restructuring. This is a missing piece, as I said, from the the post-World War II multilateral architecture. There's been no progress in the last 9 years. The last piece of progress was a resolution from the UN in 2015 that basically laid out 9 principles for the creation of such a mechanism. But there was an overwhelming support. 6 countries voted against, but they turned out to be the 6 creator jurisdictions of the world. So the US, the UK, Japan, well, not the 6 from the Western world, and Japan that votes with the US, and Israel that votes with the US, Germany and Canada that votes with the US. So there's been no progress since then, but until we don't have this, we're not going to resolve the problem of the system. The second has to do with improving contracts, and there is room for improving contracts. We could have contracts that align the scheduled payments with payment capacity. You pay more when you can pay more, and you pay less when you can pay less, like GDP index bonds. In the current restructurings, we are seeing issuances of contingent bonds, but unfortunately, they are not designed to improve sustainability. They are designed to maximize the recovery value of creditors. When you're in a negotiation, you have no idea, or you probably know, some of you may know, the kind of ideas you get from creditors. Okay? You have to be well prepared for dealing with this. And everything happens very fast. And a mistake is super costly for the country. But countries are issuing now debt that basically has no protection in the downside. If a country does badly, it still has to pay a lot. But if it does well, it pays more. So it's this kind of asymmetric contingent bond that doesn't necessarily improve sustainability. But there is a space for improving. The private sector says, look, there is no much need for... let me tell you quickly one thing. 50% of the sovereign debt of emerging economies in the international landscape is issued under New York law, and 30% approximately under English law. So New York is the most important jurisdiction. If there is a debt crisis, you have to negotiate within the New York legal frameworks. And if a creditor sue the government, it will happen in the US courts. New York legislation has massive flaws. Let me tell you a couple. If a country defaults, the interest that keeps accumulating until there is a judgment is 9%. 9% in US dollars. Okay? That interest rate was, so basically the country keeps accumulating arrears and the creditor keeps accumulating a claim much higher than most of the investments that are feasible. That rate was set in 1981. The inflation rate in the US by then was 8.9%. So it made sense, 9%, it covers some inflation. Inflation rate came down. It never changed. The interest rate, the compensatory interest rate never changed. It's lobbying. And now we're fighting for changing that. We already got in the New York Senate the approval. And now we're working for getting the approval of the Assembly. And there is another element of the law, it's called champerty. It says that it used to say no one can buy debt or a security in default with the intent of litigating against the issuer. So if you buy a security in default, you better have the intention of negotiating. I mean, there is no reasonable expectation of getting repaid in full. It's already in default. There was one case, Peru, 1998, in which a hedge fund, Elliott, bought Peruvian debt in default at half of its face value, 50 cents on the dollar. And it sued. And the New York District Court said, champerty applies. You bought the debt with the intention of litigating. And so you are not entitled to get this claim in full. And Elliott appealed to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals reverted the decision of the First District Court. It said, no, Elliott bought the debt with the intention of getting paid in full or otherwise to litigate. So the intent was contingent. So champerty doesn't apply. You are fine. You are entitled to get full face value, plus compensatory interest, 9%, etc. Of course, that was totally unreasonable, because if you buy at 50 cents on the dollar, are you really expecting to get 100 cents? Not really. That's not a reasonable expectation. But then, one day, someone, a lawmaker, New York legislation, maybe the New York Albany, New York Assembly, may be the most transactional, to say it politely, space in the US. Someone entered a bill to remove champerty for any purchase of securities above $500,000. So if you buy more than $500,000 of bonds, champerty doesn't apply. You can litigate. So that proliferated the business of what we call the vulture funds. The funds that buy debt in default only to litigate and get a better deal, and they create more a problem of moral hazard. If they win, others want to do the same, but the country can't pay everyone. Otherwise, it wouldn't have had the crisis. It wouldn't be any crisis. So we're trying to change that as well. Many creditors say, no, 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 it's not necessary, because we already improved the system in 2014 with the adoption of better contracts, an element called enhanced collective action clauses for aggregating different creditors and binding the minorities to what the majority accepts. And then I asked them, we had a meeting now at the World Bank and IMF annual meetings to discuss this with a bunch of creditors, the ICMA, the International Capital Market Association, a few academics, Stiglitz, Lee Buchheit, who is a very well-known legal scholar and lawyer, myself. And the argument was, I was asking them, okay, tell me, you say that the collective action clauses resolve all the problems. How many cases did we have in which they were applied? 2. And one, I was the one leading that, that managed that case, Argentina in 2020, the other Ecuador in 2020. And if I tell you how I finished Argentina's restructuring, you will see that things work differently. So let me tell you in a second. It took time, but much less than what it takes. So basically, we started the negotiation immediately when we took office in December 2019. And the differences were enormous between the creditor demands and the position of the debtor, okay? And they were narrowing down, but different rounds of negotiations, a lot of lobbying, a lot of noise. And at some point, the New York Times, in August, published an article, an op-ed, in which it was bashing Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, making Larry Fink look bad. And that was bad publicity. So when that op-ed came out, the negotiations were stuck. There have been days with no progress. So the creditors came back to the negotiating table because it was too costly to continue the fight. In terms of a public image at the international level, I don't think it's so nice to go to the golf course in the morning and read the New York Times and get that kind of thing, right? Good. So we managed to agree in a few days with the majority of the creditors, but we had one that had a blocking position, had enough position of bonds, holdings of bonds, that would block the entire restructuring. And on a Saturday, we had agreed with almost everyone, but we had this one. And on a Sunday, same story. And on Monday, someone discovered that this person was an American citizen that had not entered the US for more than a decade. So that was strange, right? Well, there is a part of the story that we leave aside, but 14 hours later, that person accepted to be a part of the deal. So, and then someone says, it's the collective action clauses. I mean, they help, but they don't suffice. They are far from being enough. Ecuador will probably have to do the restructuring again soon because it won't be able to pay. And it was the other case in which these clauses were used. I'm going to skip this. And the last one, what can be done to improve, to adopt capital account regulations in a more widespread way, on inflows mainly. And by the way, if you're interested, we have a paper in which we explain in detail what Argentina did from 2005 to 2010, the regulations on inflows, not on outflows, but on inflows, and how to adapt those to the technologies today, to the fact that bonds are used for exchanging currency and so forth. But of course, this would be more effective if there were changes in the institutional views of the international organizations. But as we discussed at the beginning, that goes against the power dynamic, because this is part of a political agenda. If we adopt more, if we have a more widespread adoption of capital account regulations, business gets affected. And let me tell you one more thing on the data, very important. There is a paper 2022, I didn't include it, 2023, I didn't include it in the references here, I should have, by Mayer, Carmen Reinhardt, and Christophe Trebesch. It's called Sovereign Bonds Since Waterloo. Waterloo is the victory of, the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1813 that led to the creation of sovereign states, the first wave post Waterloo, Latin America, and later on Africa. So we have the beginning of issuance of sovereign debt in new states. And they compute the return of the historical return, what we call the ex-post return of the US Treasury bonds and UK Treasury bonds, and of all the other countries. And they compare those ex-post returns. Ex-post means that you already account for all the defaults, their restructurings. So if a country didn't pay, lower return. Sometimes it pay, and it pay the country risk premium. What do you think? Oh, first tell me, if we were living in the world of perfect competition, capital competing for opportunities, should be? Equal, exactly. They should be equal. Well, you could say, well, creditors are risk averse, but you're going to get the less risk averse creditor having a comparative advantage for investing. So the assumption actually in economic models is risk neutrality for that reason. So exactly, you should get equalization over 200 years. It's a long enough sample such that you could have wins and losses gains and losses, extra gains and losses should compensate each other and get about the same return. What do you think you get? What pays off more? Yes, sir, developing countries. So the ex-post return from developing countries is on average 420 points higher, 410 points higher than the US Treasury bonds. Imagine this. Imagine that you have 25% of debt to GDP in foreign currency. And times 400 basis points. That's 1 point of GDP of transfer from the country in the south to the financial sector in the north. 1 point of GDP. The entire budget of Argentina in science and technology is 0.3% of GDP. So it's 3 times the budget of, it's a transfer of rents. There is no perfect competition. Of course, to understand why there are rents, we need to understand the power dynamic, the structure of the environment, the rules, who shapes the rule, how they are shaped. Okay? So the capital account regulations go against that kind of situation. But again, that's part of a political agenda because there are returns from doing that. Let me stop here by saying that the development, sovereign debt is of enormous importance for understanding development prospects. Sovereign debt crisis can mark the lives of a generation. I studied economics. I started in 2001, the year of crisis in my country, because of this. But they have enormous consequences. And the problems that we discussed today go beyond just crisis. They are about the organization of the system for using financing for economic development. So I think there is importance and room for doing a lot in the academic sphere to inform policy better, even if the power dynamics is what eventually dominates in the policy part. Thank you very much.
We'll take 3 questions, if you guys can be.
Well, Martin, tell you a small story, then I will make a question. You spoke about the Brady Plan. I was finance minister of Brazil at that time, and the Brady Plan was my proposal. Baker, supported by his vice minister, his deputy, rejected, very imperialistically way. No. But 18 months later, Brady took fully the plan. Well, and I was at that time doing what you are doing now with this idea of regulating foreign finance of development. My good friend Martin, I think that you are enxugando gelo. How you say in English this?
Dry as ice.
Dry.
Oh, enxugando gelo.
Hielo. Muy bien. You might understand, except for very, very poor countries, for countries have some structured economy, the simple solution is no foreign finance. So, because you made a beautiful argument against foreign finance. New development, and your argument finally is an argument about the threat of balance of payment or currency crisis in several ways, which have a terrible effect on the economy when this happens. New developmentalism added to this the idea is that when you incur in current account deficits, so to get indebted and need financing, you appreciate your currency. You encourage consumption and discourage investment. So, what really you should do, you have the strength of Mr. Stiglitz. You should discuss with Mr. Stiglitz this item in new developmentalism and say, well, you have to have a radical position. No regulation. I believe that it's useless to make regulation, because regulations will be controlled by the rich countries, by the empire. And a central characteristic of the empire is that it wants to export capitals. So they want to make loans. This is part of this logic. The only way is the developing countries realize that this is a very bad solution for them. It's difficult because each prime minister or president of each country, he'll try to get a foreign loan so he can make more some works, invest something inside and show a good administration. Besides, all the rentier capitalists and all the public in general will be very happy with an overvalued currency. So the pressure inside the country to get a loan is very high. And this must be denounced. You must denounce both sides. Denounce the system of making loans and denouncing the system of getting loans.
May I respond? Go to the next. Muito obrigado, professor Bresser. Você é exemplo de liderança. Liderança é boa palavra, sim. E the call, you're still with the calls, but here, and I really appreciate that you're here today. Thank you so much. And for the question and the comments. So first on the Brady plan, it was a very good idea. When it was applied, it worked, but it was delayed because of the geopolitics. The American banks needed more time, right? So that was the issue. I remember one situation. I was in Trento. We were in a closed summer school in Trento. And we had the person that was running the policy, the financial policy for Latin America in the New York Fed in the 80s. By then working in Japan, in the Nomura Institute, and retire, basically. So being very frank about what the Fed was doing, and we had a person that had been in Argentina's government on the other side of the negotiations at the same time, and the person, the former New York Fed, was explaining that they had to use all the power to extract as much as possible until the American banks were afloat. And it was this situation of the other side feeling all the pain. But again, so that's the politics dominates. And that's why things did not come earlier or by the time you were the finance minister. With respect to the role of capital account regulations, the way I see them is as a defensive measure that needs to be applied domestically. It's not an international policy. It's a domestic policy, which is a defensive measure for given how the international financial architecture works. Because given that international finance is not going to change, or at least not with the significance that is needed, countries, by adopting these regulations, discourage this kind of unstable flows. So again, it's a domestic policy. Of course, given the way the system works, the implication is that try not to get financing from foreign creditors in foreign jurisdiction in foreign currency, because it ends up hurting you. African countries in 2009-10 would have done better by not borrowing. They were saying, no, but I have, this is, the benefits from borrowing can be high, but the cost from borrowing can be higher, and they're paying the price now. So, that, by the way, when I pushed new legislation in Argentina, making mandatory the approval of Congress for any borrowing in foreign currency in the foreign law, that's a defensive measure for this system, for how the system works. So that's with the private sector. With the official sector, my view is that given how the system works, countries should try to empower regional institutions more rather than international institutions. For instance, in Latin America, in South America, or Latin America, I would like to see a stronger CAF. Of course, we have the BNDES, but we know. But I would like to see a stronger CAF. Is that possible? I think so, but sometimes, not sometimes, our own countries replicate the architecture of others that are serving to others and not to our own countries. Let me give you the example of Brazil. In 2021, you receive about $16 billion of special drawing rights from the IMF. The IMF issue an allocation of $650 billion. It's distributed according to the quota of each country. So you get $16 billion of liquidity. You have a law that regulates the financial system and it regulates the central bank, that it says, I don't remember the name, you will know, that it says that the SDRs are held by the central bank rather than by the treasury, and they are a reserve asset, so they can't be touched. You didn't have those SDRs a minute before the issuance. All of a sudden you have them and you can't use them at all. And if you could use them, you could be playing the role of that China plays in Africa, but in Latin America. It's a lot of money for the continent, but you can't, because you have an architecture that resembles the it's as if it was some cognitive capture in the society. So you can't play an enabling role for development financing in the region, which you would benefit enormously. Imagine if you are the one financing, say, the pipeline of Argentina, the gas pipeline. You would probably want to influence the regulations for making sure that you don't pay that much for the gas, or the same for electricity grid, or if you develop infrastructure projects, you will probably have the capacity to enable the projects that are going to benefit the Brazilian economy. You will be more powerful, but you don't use that opportunity. And that's not just a problem of Brazil. Brazil is the biggest country in the region, but it's a general problem. So, yes, that kind of, in this system that I described, relying on the financing from the private sector can be very costly. Or relying on the financing from the IMF can be very, very costly. Okay? We didn't talk much about the IMF today, hopefully another time. It would be different if it was our own institution with our own governance, but we don't use the opportunities that we have for that. In a new developmentalism, that's the kind of feature that I would want to see for the financial part. That has to be part of a new developmentalism idea. Yeah? And I will be concise in my answers.
A long time ago, I heard from Mr. Guillermo Calvo that more or less, because there is a case, favorite case for capital controls, but the problem is how to do it. Guillermo Calvo argues that if a developing country wishes to implement capital control, such capital control would be in form of net inflows, and that covers all flows, including foreign investment direct, because companies has ways of escaping from capital. I'd like to know if you are also favor.
The answer is yes. So regulation on inflows that cover all forms of capital, and there is self-selection. For FDI, it won't be important because FDI stays in the country for long periods. For portfolio capital, it will be binding, so it will probably discourage portfolio capital.
We'll take just one more question here. I think it's
Thank you again. Fantastic presentation. Very simple question. If on one hand you have such good business on the lending side and it's a cartel basically, what's the role and the challenges to forming a debtor cartel worldwide to negotiate better regulation, better rates, and even taking the evidence from 200 years of lending to developing countries, that the risk premium is more than a risk premium, right? It's like a risk rent, basically.
Good. So there are two stages of coordination. One is, stage one is coordination for setting the rules of the game. Stage two is coordination at the moment of a crisis. Creditors are very good at coordinating at stage one. Less good at stage two, although better than the debtor. But at stage one, in contracts, for instance, you have a clause called, in virtually every debt contract, you have a clause called cross default. So if you default on one bond, you default on all the bonds. You don't have anything similar for debtors. You don't have a clause that says if a creditor doesn't cooperate with one debtor, it doesn't get paid by any other debtor. You don't have anything like that, right? So the problem with the debtors is that the incentives are very different in every moment for every debtor. Why is the government, imagine the situation of the government of Ethiopia. It wants to win the next election. Why is going to cooperate with Sri Lanka, assuming that Sri Lanka wants to do the same thing, which it doesn't, if it has a political cost in the short term. It doesn't happen. That's the way the Cartagena club was broken, using Mexico. Thank you very much.
Just make two announcements to everyone to have 15 minutes break. I prefer to I think it's good. So we have 15 minutes break to, well, get a coffee, continue the discussion. Then we go to the rooms for the round tables or for the article discussions. And for lunch today, we have a reservation in the same place that we went yesterday. So for those that want to go with us, it's in Wall Street Hotel again. And that's it. You all.
The rules are on